Hello and welcome to Comics Over Time. This season, which we're calling Murdock and Marvel, a history of Marvel Comics starring Daredevil, is our most ambitious project yet. Our plan is to look at the state of the comic book industry during a particular year, and then to examine in detail the major ways that Marvel Comics in particular evolved during that year. We'll look at who was creating comics, what new characters or storylines were introduced, and which comics either debuted or ended. After that, we'll get down to business, take out our stack of Daredevil comics, and look at what our old friend, the Man Without Fear, was up to during that same time. We're glad you've joined us. My name is Duane, and with me, as always, my good buddy Dan. Dan, how you doing this evening?
Doing great. Nice to be back. Had a week off to go and enjoy a bit of time in lovely Arizona, watch some baseball. And now it's time to get back down to talking comic books. We're actually starting the second decade of the Marvel era, Duane. So congratulations to us.
Hey!
70s actually saw some significant changes and challenges for comics in general and Marvel in specific that we'll find out as we go along here. And so we'll start to see these immediately as we begin to take a look at the very first year of this eventful decade, 1970, in comics and Marvel Comics and Daredevil. Oh my.
It'd be a lot of fun. I am definitely getting more used to these older style comics. Reading through them a little bit faster. Not still isn't like blazing speed like the newer stuff, but there's some interesting stories that we're going to talk about. Some lots of interesting things that are happening. But first, just a quick question. Steve Ditko is now a Disney legend?
Yeah, so this has become something that's been kind of interesting to see. I mean, since we're talking about all these classic creators, figured we could maybe mention that evidently Disney is honoring Steve Ditko as sort of one of the people who made Disney at the D23 Disney Legends show. And so this is going to be a little weird because he, of course, hated to have his picture taken, and his picture's there. He hated to be celebrated or to have any of this sort of stuff. So a lot of people are like, he would just hate this. But the fact he hates it and was sort of, this curmudgeon doesn't mean his family isn't happy about it. They actually had a lawsuit going against Marvel/Disney for like some of the creative rights and ownership of some of the things he created for Marvel.
Sure.
They came to a big agreement to the lawsuit sometime last year. And a lot of people think that them starting to honor Ditko and bring his name and legacy in sort of the same way as Stan Lee and Jack Kirby is part of what the family sort of wanted as part of the settlement. So, yeah, Ditko might have been angry about it, but evidently his grandchildren want his face and the fact that he was the guy who created Spider-Man out there where people can see it. So, kind of interesting.
I think that's good, don't you?
I do. I know that Steve Ditko would have hated it, but
Right.
Steve Ditko hated almost everything. So really,
Yes.
it's not really worth worrying about how he would have felt about it because he'd have been angry.
Right.
So, blanket statement about almost everything.
It looks like you have an update about C2E2 and the panel that you're going to be giving with your daughter.
Yep, we got the updated information, and they've settled on panel dates and the like. So it looks like we will be at C2E2 in Chicago on Saturday, April 27th in room S405B, doing a panel on digital comics from 10:30 to 11:30 a.m. So probably keep mentioning this every once in a while as we get closer to the date. But yeah, if you're out there and happen to be coming to C2E2, we'd love it if you'd come and say hi, join us, talk some comics.
That is very cool. I am very excited to hear how that goes. I wish I could be there in person, but I with that day actually being my wife's birthday, I just don't think that's going to happen.
We'll get you there one of these years. It can't be on the birthday every year. So
right. The year in comics. All right, Dan, tell us about the year in comics in 1970, or at least let's start with where do we start with comics in 1970?
So the first thing is this is kind of a barrier region between two of the major eras in comics. So this is the end of the Silver Age of comics and the start of the Bronze Age of comics. And 1970 is looked at as sort of the year when this break happens. It obviously is not a simple cutover line. So thinking of 1970 as some sort of hard delineation point where everything that came after is new and everything that came before is old would be inaccurate and a little simplistic.
Okay.
However, there is something to be said about it. There's two major things, I think, that drive us to look at this year as the end of the Silver Age and the start of the Bronze. The ending part, probably a lot of it has to do with the fact that this is the year when Jack Kirby leaves Marvel. And so it just feels like an end of an age in that the Silver Age is sort of delineated by this rise of superhero comics. Kirby and the Fantastic Four and what he does at Marvel is a big part of that. When he leaves, there is sort of this breaking up of the band sort of feel to it.
Sure.
The second thing is that in April of 1970, Green Lantern Green Arrow number 76 comes out and basically changes everything in terms of the way we think about comic books as collectors.
What happened? What happened there?
This was the first team up between Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams, and it was a story where Green Lantern had been sort of a book that had been dying. They were getting ready to cancel it, and as so many times happens, that's when the best comics are made, because the editors aren't watching. They just need some kids to come in and fill out a few issues so that they get the subscription runs done or whatever. And they don't really care what they do. So nobody's watching, and suddenly, you get this fantastic thing.
Those two guys go on to have like legendary careers, and so this was
legendary careers, and they're legendary together because not only do they make about a 10-issue run or so on Green Lantern, Green Arrow that deals with race relations, it deals with cultural fights, it deals with drug abuse, it deals with all sorts of topics that have been considered completely taboo, and it does it in a way that's so effective that if you look at the Shazam Awards for that year, Green Lantern wins Best Story for number 76, Best Continuing Series, O'Neill wins Best Writer, Adams wins Best Penciler, Giordano wins Best Inker. They won the entire award.
They took the hat trick, basically.
So basically, everybody's just like, if it's a drama book, we're just voting for this one because it's the best thing we've seen in ages. And they then went on the next year, or later that year, to actually start revamping Batman. And as much as I love the Green Lantern, Green Arrow stuff, it's when they take over Batman that they really just change everything. Because Batman becomes much more that darker, sort of more street level, vigilante almost type of character. There's still a lot more code restrictions and stuff, so it's not like this is Dark Knight. But a lot of these first issues are still some of my favorite Batman stories of all time. So I think that that sort of leaving of the old generation exemplified by Kirby, and there's also a lot of other guys who are just retiring or being sort of forced out. And then the new guys coming in. We'll see like 4 or 5 new writers coming into Marvel this year. Almost all of them go on to have a massive influence on the industry. It really is kind of an odd juxtaposition in this year where you start to see what's going on. The one note is this is largely a superhero thing, though. Archie does not have a silver and a bronze age necessarily.
Okay,
right?
I was sort of wondering that actually.
Archie is Archie. Richie Rich is Richie Rich. They do not really change over much at this time. Another thing that's going on, those underground comics we've been talking about continue to flourish. We had one of the first comics created all by women called It Ain't Me, Babe. We had Slow Death #1. We had Young Lust #1, which was sort of a parody of all of the romance comics that was much dirtier than all of the romance comics.
Sure.
All those came out. One thing that's also weird, though, is kind of like the independent comics of market we'll see in the 80s, the underground scene started to really be almost overrun by cheap, poor quality books, because people were seeing a market at the head shops and the other smaller vendors, and there were a lot of people who came out with some really terrible comic books during that time, put the X on the end to call it comics, and tried to make a quick buck. There's some stuff out there that's really good. There's some stuff that's really bad in the comics of this time. Comics with an X. We started to see some history. There's 2 really cool histories I enjoy that came out this year. The Steranko History of Comics by Jim Steranko. We saw some of his art and stuff like that. Was actually
recognize the name.
Yep, published in sort of an oversized comic kind of format. And there was also a book called All in Color for a Dime by a guy named Richard A. Lupoff that came out in 1970. So we're starting to see, kind of like a few years ago, we'd started to see the collector market start to take off. Now these are the first real efforts at tracking the history of American comics in either a more journalistic, in the case of Steranko, or a more actual historical way in the case of Lupoff. And these are some of the earliest books. When I was going back and starting to research on comics, this was some of the stuff that I first started to go through, or some of the earliest stuff among the things I was going through.
That's really, really interesting. I guess comics had been around long enough that they really did have like an actual history to them that people would want to potentially learn more about. And so I'm sure it makes sense. And, you know, I keep thinking, for whatever reason, that, you know, things haven't been around as long as they have, but they have been around for a long time. And so it's, you know, as I'm finding out week after week as we're doing this, there's a lot going on, a lot that can be, you know, cataloged and for future reference.
Yep. And a lot of this stuff, I mean, you know, when you start talking about New Fun and things like that, comics, as we know them, really started in the mid-30s. But so by that point, there would have been 35 plus years of history that Steranko and Lupoff were writing about. I also will probably note this a few times, but one of the things that now strikes me as crazy is that I bought my first comic books in like 1980, right?
Mm-hmm.
Comic books I bought then are older now than Action Comics #1 was when I bought those comics. And that freaks me out. So I don't know if I've said that before in the podcast, but it's something that I find kind of crazy. So these guys were dealing with a much shorter history than we have now, but still, we were starting to see a little of that appreciation.
So you have a note here that there was the first comic book price guide came out in 1970.
At the very least, it's the first Overstreet price guide. There'd been a couple of other efforts at making price guides.
Okay.
A lot of them were more pamphlet-y and stuff like that. But this was actually a full-sized book that was a price guide on comic books. Overstreet had been working on it for a while. He worked with a couple of other people who'd been working on getting pricing stuff. And this ended up being a first edition that was priced at $5, and there were 1,000 copies printed initially, total. Eventually, it was like another 800 or something that came out. So it's actually a relatively limited edition type of thing when you think about it.
Yeah.
But in 1970, the number of people who were actively collecting comics and paying good prices for them was probably, significant, but not as significant as it would be later.
Right.
So the crazy thing is, though, that you'd think that the first comic book price guide would be a big deal. Even bigger, probably, is the first what's called Golden State Comic Book Convention was held in San Diego, of all places, with a grand total of 300 attendees in its first year.
Okay.
Now, you may have heard of this under another name. It's been held every year since, except the 2 pandemic years, 2020 and 2021. Of course, it's now known as the San Diego Comic-Con International.
Yes.
And it is tens of thousands of people.
Yes.
All sorts of the hoi polloi and the world's most famous and and everyone else is there. And it's much more than a comic book convention now.
Right.
But it started this year. There'd been other
started
comic
in
conventions.
1970. Wow. 300 people.
Yep.
That is crazy. You think about how big that is now. And I have never been. I think I would want to just once. I don't know if it's a thing I could do year in and year out.
I've been trying to get tickets for years. I've never actually been able to get them. So I would love to go. But yeah.
Yeah.
But it's crazy to think that the first one was smaller than the Fargo comic conventions that are held around here now a couple times a year. Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned the Shazam Awards. I'm not familiar with these. What are these?
Well, what were these? Which is one of the reasons you're not familiar with them.
Sure.
Shazam Awards actually were only given 5 years. Reason for that is that they were created under the oversight of something called the Academy of Comic Book Arts, which was Stan Lee's idea and was essentially his attempt to create something like the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences that does the Oscars, only for comics. And so the Shazams were going to be like the Oscars of the comics. But again, to show the differences between your Silver Age guys and your Bronze Age guys, within a couple of years, Neil Adams had managed to take over the Academy of Comic Book Arts, turned it into an organization that basically was focused on union rights and like sticking it to the publishers and everything. And Stan Lee left, and eventually they disbanded the thing, or at least disbanded the awards. So Lee was very unhappy about this. He's like, I don't want it to be political. I just want it to be, awards. Neil Adams was more like, awards are great, but I'd rather have fair pay and dental insurance, right? And so
makes sense.
So because of that, after 1974, these were discontinued. The nice thing about them in terms of awards was that they were like the Oscars. The voting was limited to people in the comic industry, and they were therefore kind of an award that was voted on by other peers, much like some of the newer awards like the Kirbys and later the Eisners do. Unfortunately, from 1974 until sometime in the 80s, we didn't really have a set of awards like this. So for the next 4 years, we'll have some Shazam awards we can talk about. Once we get to the middle or the late part of the 70s and the early 80s, we're really not going to have these. There'll be other award things, Comic Buyer's Guide, some things like that we'll be able to look at. But yeah, for this year, for the very first one, it was a shower of accolades upon DC and more specifically Green Arrow, Green Lantern, which, if you haven't read them, so fantastic. They're available in reprints all over the place. And in fact, I believe at least at one point, Green Lantern number 76 was the most reprinted comic book in DC history. So
I might have to read that, since this seems like something that I should read. And Denny O'Neil, Neil Adams.
Yep.
Yeah. The year in Marvel.
Excelsior.
All right, Dan, we've gotten through the main year in comics. Let's talk about Marvel more specifically. What was going on at Marvel in 1970?
Yeah, so Marvel had an interesting year. They had their new distribution deal in place, and they had their new owner, and so they kept expanding. The bullpen at this point is bursting with all sorts of new young writing talent. Marvel is continuing to expand out in sort of all directions, and they actually had 15 new titles that covered nearly every major comic genre. Wow. Also, if you look at the chart I put in our notes, man, are they publishing a lot of stuff compared to just a couple of years ago.
Yeah, that is a pretty extensive list.
There's like 30 or 40 books, something like that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We'll have to figure out a way that we can share this chart on social media so that you all can see this at home. But yeah, there is all the way from Amazing Adventures all the way down to an X-Men annual, all came out in 1970.
Yeah, so if we look at it in terms of new titles, there were a few superhero ones that came out. They brought out a couple of the double feature books, kind of like the way Journey into Mystery and stuff like that used to be.
Sure.
Amazing Adventures #1 came out. It had Black Widow and the Inhumans. The Black Widow book is interesting because it is, as far as I can tell, the first female superhero solo stories in the Marvel Universe.
Oh, okay.
She doesn't have her own title, right? Because she's sharing, but she's
Right.
on the masthead. We've got actually a Black Canary logo on the front of Amazing Adventures. And the Inhumans are initially one of the first books that Kirby has been able to do where it says written and drawn by Jack Kirby. Stan Lee is not involved.
Sure.
Technically, I think he's on as an editor, but he doesn't do anything on these. This is Kirby actually getting to do his own thing at Marvel. So that only happens for the first probably 4 or 5 books, though. And then we have Kirby moving on because he's leaving Marvel. And Neil Adams initially takes over the art and does some really fantastic art. So the Inhumans books that Adams is drawing, the stories were a little bit crazy. I'm not sure they were the best, but the art is fantastic. So well worth checking those out. So I like the Amazing Adventure books. The Black Widow stories are also interesting in that, in a lot of ways, she kind of almost resembles an Emma Peel type character. And I think what they're doing is, we kind of talked last year about how, or a couple of years ago, about Wonder Woman sales started to go up after they took her costume away and made her more of like almost a super spy type of character.
Okay.
Black Widow is kind of a response to that, probably, in that she's got a very similar place. She's got some romance going, and she's going around solving various espionage type adventures, that sort of thing.
All right. Very cool.
Next book we see is Astonishing Tales, another double feature. This one's got Kazar and Doctor Doom. What I like about this is the artists. Again, you talk Bronze Age, Silver Age, here we go. Kazar is drawn by Barry Windsor Smith. It's his first big assignment.
Recognize
Fantastic,
that name. Recognize
right?
that name, yeah.
Yep, he's going to go on and take over Conan, written by Roy Thomas a little later in the year, but first he does a series here for Kazar. Probably was kind of an addition for the Conan idea, I suppose, because Kazar and Conan are not that, other than the fact that Kazar doesn't kill everyone and Conan does, but that's the, it's kind of the jungle adventure thing. And then the Doom story, Dr. Doom gets his own half of the book, and Wally Wood draws that. And so it's really interesting because Windsor Smith is this sort of crazy new guy who, he looks sort of like Jack Kirby on acid a little bit, right? Even more on acid than Jack Kirby's stuff normally looks, would maybe be another way to put it. And then Wally Wood, the classic just illustrator delineation, everything looks so clean, but really good stuff.
We've seen some Daredevil comics that were done by Wally Wood very early on.
Yep. So like 7, 8, 9, right around in that area. Yep.
Yeah.
And then those Conan the Barbarians, really great stuff. I've made a point of collecting all of these over the years because I love the Roy Thomas, Barry Windsor Smith stories. Later on, Red Sonja is going to be introduced in these and the like, but the stories are a lot of fun. One interesting thing I found out is that they actually didn't initially want to go after Conan because they didn't think they could afford the licensing on him. So they went after some other sword and sorcery hero that I've never heard of. And
Okay.
they couldn't get that contract. So on a lark, they're like, well, we'll just talk to the Conan guys. And they were like, yeah, sure, go for it. And so Conan came into the Marvel Universe, and I think it's been really good for both of them. Because Conan's sort of visibility with younger generations went through the roof with a successful comic book, and there was a lot of really good material for Roy Thomas to build off of in that.
Sure.
Now to the bad stuff. There was also a Kazar miniseries, 3 issues, all reprints in the front. They reprinted stories from X-Men, Daredevil, and Amazing Spider-Man. These were not even 2 or 3 years old, and they're already doing reprints on them. There's an Angel story in the back that's original, but still, they're basically just reusing material with a new cover. There's Iron Man Special #1, which is reprints. There's X-Men Annual #1, which is reprints. We have 3 new monster books called Fear, Where Creatures Roam, and Where Monsters Dwell, which are all reprints of 50s stuff. They're kind of awesome because some of these stories are wacky and fun, but they're also terrible because they're not doing anything new. They're just literally taking old stuff from previous things, repackaging it, and putting it out.
Yeah.
They brought out 2 new Western books, Outlaw Kid and Ringo Kid, both of which are reprints of Outlaw Kid and Ringo Kid comic books from the 50s. And then they brought out Western Gunfighters, which actually did have a few 10-page new stories. But the comics were 50 to 68-page giants for like a quarter or something. And everything else in them was just reprints.
Oh, no.
So of the 15 books that they brought out this year, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, like 9 of them were reprint stuff. So
not great.
Really awful, actually, right? The other ones were stuff from other types of genres, and they were almost as bad. They had one called Harvey. Harvey is a teenager, a red-haired teenager, who's busy trying to date the rich brunette girl while also kind of romancing the blonde girl who lives next door to him. It is, and they even changed the masthead so it looks like Archie. So they literally just ripped off Archie comics and put a Harvey sticker on it instead. They've got something called Little Kids, which is just Harvey and his friends as youngsters, which is a ripoff directly of the successful Little Archie comics. They've got something called Spoof, which was essentially Mad Magazine, just in comic form. It wasn't particularly good, and they subtitled it The Lunatic Side of Life. Lasted like 5 issues, and it was gone. So almost everything they put out this year, except for Amazing Adventures, Astonishing Tales, and Conan, was either derivative or reprints.
Can I ask, how do you think all these reprints were received? Like if you're going to a store and you're seeing this, like, do they expect that a lot of people hadn't seen it the first time, and so they thought they could get it out there again? Or like, and then like, what happens if you did see this before? Like, I'm kind of curious just what the thinking was in doing this, and then how it was received, I guess.
So I think, #1, they'd done reprints before. There were reprint editions that came out that reprinted like the early Fantastic Fours and stuff like that. And those were received extremely well because a lot of people were reading this stuff and they'd missed it when it came out, and they loved the fact to get a copy of Fantastic Four #1 to read because you didn't have the internet or something where you could go and get,
Sure.
But all of this stuff, I'm almost certain, had a significantly negative effect on Marvel. Because what it did is it diluted the Marvel brand badly. A lot of this stuff, even if the stories are okay, all the cars are 1950s cars. All the hairstyles are 1950s hairstyles.
Sure.
All the jokes are 1950s jokes. And what they would do is they would go in and modify the things that needed to be modified to make it so it wasn't quite so obvious what's going on. But still, most people would be able to see that this stuff was old. And a lot of other companies did it. I mean, Dell, reprinted the Ducks comics and stuff like that. But I think that for a lot of those companies that were really directed to kids, if you reprinted Chippendale, nobody cared if the Chipmunks had their story told 10 years previously. Marvel was kind of, their niche was being something that was hip and new.
Right.
And there's nothing hip and new about 70% of your new comics being reprints from 15 years ago.
Sure. No, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think this was bad. And you can see it even in the new characters that came out this year. When I was looking through to see who the new characters that were brought into the universe were in 1970, you had Conan, who of course is new to Marvel.
Right.
Eddie March, who was the first Black Iron Man, debuted. Relatively relatively quickly was injured, and Tony Stark took the armor back. So this is pre-Rhodey, though. You had Sunfire, the Japanese mutant. Red Wolf, who was a Native American superhero. You had Orca, the human killer whale, and Lyra, who were Submariner villains. You had the Schemer, which is Richard Fisk, essentially the Kingpin's son.
Okay.
The Kingpin's son sort of started to take after his dad there.
Right.
You had the Petrified Man, Agatha Harkness, and then Jim Wilson, who, when Rick Jones went off to hang out with Captain Marvel and the rest, they needed a replacement for him. And so they brought in a new Rick Jones, only he was a black guy. And that's Jim Wilson. Same irritating teen, just black instead of white. Because Rick Jones needed to be other places. So he was in a lot of Hulk books over the years. Actually, he's been a relatively long-running character, sort of like Jones. But when you look at the characters created, I mean, in some ways, I think Agatha Harkness is the most important character created in 1970.
Yes.
And that is not good.
I mean, yeah. I recognize a couple others of this, just in my Marvel Snap information, helping me with a few of these names. But otherwise, I just, before started playing that game, Agatha Harkness is the only one on this list that I would really recognize outside of course, Conan. But,
Yeah, kind of crazy. So does Orca, the human killer whale, have his own card in Snap?
He does, actually.
He does not.
He does.
You've got to be kidding me.
Yes, he is he was not original when the game launched. He is a card that got added since it launched. And yes, Orca, the killer whale. He is a card that, if I remember right, he's a 6 energy card that gets additional power if he's the only one at the location. So.
Oh my goodness. Alrighty.
All right, so we don't really have the names necessarily when it comes to new characters, but was there at least some big moments that occurred with the existing characters that we had?
There were, but again, considering the number of titles you're seeing them publishing right now, it is not as much as you'd think, right?
I would expect a lot, actually, given that count.
Yeah, it should have been. Fantastic Four number 100 came out, where they had a battle royale with all the villains and everything like that. So that was kind of a classic. Captain Marvel returned, and then was gone again in a few issues. I'm not sure if they just needed to make sure he came back so that their copyright trademark stuff stayed in force. But he was there for a little bit. In essence, what I think we really see is that as of 1970, this illusion of change that Stan Lee had wanted to put in place is sort of in full force. You see things happen like, Bruce Banner and Betty are near getting married. And they get to the point where they're just about ready to wed. But then something comes up and they don't. And they don't actually get married until 1986, right? Professor X had been killed in one of the X-Men books until they bring him back. Turns out that, in fact, it was a shape-shifting double that had taken the professor's place. Shapeshifter died, and Professor X was off in hiding somewhere.
Even when there's a body, they could figure out a way to bring him back.
Even when there's a body. So, yeah. But, so there's a lot of things going on that don't really stick. There are a couple of real changes. One of which is in universe, and one of which is out. ASM number 90, which you will remember probably from the Across the Spider-Verse as a canon event. So that whole idea that this was one of those canon events that they talk about later. Well, Captain Stacy dies, and then relatively soon we're going to have more tragedy in the Stacy family, but at least, Gwen made it out of 1970 anyways, so we don't have to worry about that yet. As far as out of universe, the last Kirby Fantastic Four, issue number 101, is published this year, and also the last Thor, number 179. So Kirby's sort of shutting the door on a lot of these long-running books that he'd been working on and getting ready to transition over. Now, he did work ahead on a lot of stuff, so they're still going to be publishing new Kirby stuff, I think, into 1971. But Kirby himself is at this point done working for Marvel, and for a lot of his major books, all of his stuff is finished, and new people are coming in. And I think it's interesting that when this happens, Lee actually puts a note into the bulletin, just letting people know, going, hey, just want you to know so nobody's confused. Jack Kirby's decided to move away from Marvel and he won't be working with us in the near future. So, don't be surprised when you start seeing new people showing up on these books that you've been reading about for a while.
Let's transition. Let's talk about the bullpen now. You were talking about how we have Jack Kirby leaving this year. There's all these new books, even if there's reprints, there's the staff size at Marvel has increased in the last year or so, right?
It really has. It's increased a lot. And more than that, it's just gotten really interesting how many different people there are doing things where previously you'd just have had one or two that were really the major force.
Right.
So Stan Lee still has the most writing credits. He's still writing a lot of the books for Marvel, and he's doing it the way he's always done it, which is that sort of Marvel method where he's just, why don't we fight, the Vulture this week, and then the artist goes off and does everything, brings it back, and then he puts in the witty dialogue, right? Roy Thomas is now the second writer. He writes full scripts for the most part, especially starting out. So he's actually handing scripts to his artists. Larry Lieber, Stan Lee's brother, is 38 credits, and he is third. And then you've got Gary Friedrich, Archie Goodwin, Jack Kirby with those Inhumans books, Alan Brodsky, a few other people. As far as the art, when we're looking at our pencilers, you've got Jack Kirby leading the way with 64 credits. Gene Colan comes in second at 36. So our man Gene getting a lot done. That is that's a lot of story for 1 year. John Buscema at 26, Dick Ayers 19, Don Heck 19, Herb Trumpy 19, and then John Romita 15 books as well. I think my query says Steve Ditko, but I'm pretty sure he's not doing anything for Marvel right now. That must be reprints, which is the other beautiful thing about reprints is they mess up all my queries. So anyways.
Sure.
Inkers, it's interesting now how many inkers. You got Dick Ayers, you got Dick Ayers, John Severin, John Verporten, Joe Sinnott, Sid Shores, Chick Stone, Mike Esposito, Wally Wood, Tom Palmer. Sid Shores, I really have been enjoying his inks this year on Daredevil. I think he did a really nice job on them. He's been a good compliment, actually, to Colan. As far as colorists, we've actually got quite a varied list. Tom Palmer actually gets 15 credits. Marie Severin, 12. Michelle Robinson, 8. And then we've got a few others. What I find intriguing here is, do you see how many people get credits as a colorist? And how many people get credits as other things? I'm pretty sure Marie Severin and Michelle Robinson are the top two colorists at Marvel right now. Tom Palmer, when he colors stuff, he gets credited for it. When Marie Severin and Michelle Robinson color stuff, a lot of times they don't get credited for it.
Really?
I wonder why that would happen. Oh, Marvel. So
that's no good.
Or I should say, 60s, 70s America, probably.
Yeah.
I'm just blaming the company.
Sure.
And then as far as letterers, Artie Simic maintains a stranglehold with 140 books that he worked on. Sam Rosen comes in second at 98. And then Jean Simic, again, Artie's daughter, is actually the third highest credited letterer. So she's taken after Dad and coming on strong with 40 credits.
That's a lot of credits in a year. 140 is just mind-blowingly ridiculous, right? But even just to be able to be the third place and get 40 is just, that's a lot of work too.
Nope. It's basically, a book or so a week, and you're talking maybe 20 pages or whatever in each of them. Now, lettering, once you're good at it, you could probably do it relatively quick. But when you think of hand lettering, they're using guides and doing everything,
Right.
and it's got to be very precise. It's a lot of work. So
Yeah.
that is a good pile. And then after Simic at 40, Ray Holloway at 10 is our next credit level. So really, it's just those three, the two Simics and Sam Rosen, that are lettering. But so that's kind of the group. There's 86 total people credited this year on the books that comprise the Marvel Universe.
Wow. All right. Let's talk about the Rookie of the Year. We have some new people coming in. Who are our nominees for Rookie of the Year for Marvel for 1970?
And so there was about 11 new people total. But I want to just focus on 5 of them. First of all, I don't know that anytime Edgar Allan Poe debuts as a writer for your company, you can't at least mention him, right?
Sure.
The man who invented the detective story in America should at least, get some sort of. What happened here is that he actually was credited in the adaptation of his story, The Telltale Heart, from Chamber of Darkness #3.
Sure. Okay, that makes sense.
So this a true, just we'll just honorable mention him there, but
Right.
that's the only credit he had during this time frame was on that one. Mike Friedrich actually had a nice long run on Iron Man, starting in 1971 or 2 or something like that. He won an Inkpot Award in 1980 and has done a lot of work in the industry. Really, really interesting dude. I like a lot of his stories. The 3 guys, though, who are the real contenders for this sort of thing, and any of whom would actually be a decent choice, are Jerry Conway. Started in 1979. He's got 649 Marvel credits that I could find. He was also given the Inkpot Award for sort of service to comics or whatever in 2013. Conway created the Punisher, co-created the Punisher. He co-created Ms. Marvel, and he was the guy writing Spider-Man who killed Gwen Stacy. So this is a guy who has had a significant impact on Marvel Comics over time.
Yeah.
He's also written a bunch of stuff for DC and other folks, and is a really, really great writer. But so yeah, he's definitely got some bona fides. We've got Len Wein, who came in 1970 as well. He had something like 430 Marvel credits, as far as what I can find off of my copy of the database from comics.org. He is an actual Eisner Hall of Fame inductee in 2008. Co-created Wolverine with John Romita. You may have heard of Wolverine.
I have, yes.
Half of all the comics published in the 90s were Wolverine comics. He co-created the new X-Men with Dave Cockrum. So you may have also heard of those guys. It's interesting how he was also the editor-in-chief of Marvel for a little while. He started a lot of really cool things. But the thing is that Wolverine wasn't great under Len Wein. Wolverine got great under Claremont and Byrne.
Yeah.
The new X-Men didn't get great under Wein and Claremont. There was a great foundation there. I think that Wein has always been an interesting writer. I like his stuff. But to me, the clear winner this week is Marv Wolfman. Another of these guys, they all kind of came in together. They lived together and married each other's girlfriends. And it was for the longest time, it seemed like these guys were having the biggest party. They'd work at DC, they'd work at Marvel, they'd come back and forth. But he had also 469 Marvel credits that I could find. Inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2011. He created Bullseye. He created or co-created Nova, co-created Black Cat. The reason, though, why I think he probably wins the Rookie of the Year here is that besides making a bunch of cool ideas, he wrote Tome of Dracula for about a decade with Gene Colan, one of the greatest horror comics of the late 20th century. And he took Marvel in a direction that really it hadn't been in 20 some years and did a fantastic job. He co-created Blade, the Vampire Slayer. So
Right.
Bullseye's been a popular character. Black Cat's been a popular character. Nova's going to be in the MCU now, it looks like. But those Dracula books, man, they are fantastic. There's actually a way to get them, by the way. The Essentials collections that Marvel has. One of the few comic books that really deserves to be read in black and white is Gene Colan and Marv Wolfman's Tomb of Dracula. So they did it as a cheap reprint in black and white, but it's fantastic to read that way. So highly recommend, if you haven't read Tomb of Dracula, go out and get the Essentials collection and read it that way. So
Cool.
Yep.
So Marv Wolfman is the Rookie of the Year for 1970.
Apologies to Conway and Ween. Congratulations to Wolfman.
The Year in Daredevil.
All right, Duane. So that will kind of take us through the intro material. Now we get to the meat of things. Daredevil. What has Daredevil been up to this year?
All right. Daredevil this year made appearances in his main book. Issues 60 to 71 is where we're going to be looking pretty much entirely for the year. He did have an appearance outside of his book in Avengers number 82. So regarding the Daredevil run, Stan Lee continues as the editor for these books, with Roy Thomas actually writing most of them and Gene Colan continuing for yet another year as the main artist. So the year starts out with Deborah. If you remember Deborah, that is Foggy's college girlfriend that kind of came back into the picture. Deborah cancels her engagement with Foggy after the fact that she's an ex-convict comes up once more. Daredevil then takes down Crime Wave, who we were talking a little bit about a couple weeks ago, his illegal gambling ship, and captures the boss, who's revealed to be Foggy's assistant, Hollis. So Crime Wave, this really important character that was like at the end of the 1969, who was kind of behind all this stuff that was going on, turned out to be Foggy's assistant. Absolutely ridiculous. Because of course it has to be somebody you know,
but don't know too well.
Yes.
So it can be a surprise. So,
right.
Yeah.
Next, then Daredevil must deal with another villain team up as the trio of doom lure him into a trap at an old amusement park. That was actually a really cool issue, I thought. And the trio of doom, by the way, is just former villains that he's faced. Jester, Hyde, and Cobra are the trio of doom. Daredevil then gets upstaged by another would-be superhero by the name of Nighthawk, who turns out to be just another villain in disguise. That was an interesting couple book arc that I think was really interesting as well. We had Daredevil fights the Gladiator, who pretends not to be the Gladiator in an attempt to escape prison. And while this is happening, Karen, fed up with Murdock, leaves for Los Angeles. So we actually have kind of a breakup of the big three of Murdock, Nelson, and Karen Page. Karen Page decides she needs to get out of New York and goes to Los Angeles. Daredevil then heads to LA to find Karen, but instead finds the stunt master, who has agreed to steal a film as a way to try and earn money. So talk about bad luck for the stunt master, who was hired by Crime Wave to try and take down Daredevil. Daredevil beats him, so he leaves town, goes to Los Angeles. Then Daredevil goes to Los Angeles and ends up finding out that he's, trying to steal a film.
Seems unlikely, doesn't it?
It does seem
unlikely.
a bit crazy. After that, we get Karen gets a job acting on a now struggling show called Strange Secrets. After she witnesses an actor playing Brother Brimstone attack another actor, as well as her, she is stalked by this new Brother Brimstone who is trying to murder the cast and crew. Daredevil finds Karen, saves her from the La Brea tar pits, but Brother Brimstone, on the other hand, isn't quite so lucky. He ends up actually in the tar pits and ends up presumably dying when he gets pulled under.
Presumably.
Yes. So, and because of all this, then we get what is very weird. We have Stuntmaster, after Daredevil kind of puts him back on the straight and narrow, gets his own TV show in which they're bringing on Daredevil to act, and he ends up having to fight Stiltman, who is posing as Stuntmaster on the TV show during one of their filmings. Afterwards, Daredevil tells Karen that he has to go back to New York and asks her to go with. Karen declines to go with him, having found that she enjoys her career as an actress. So we now have those two splitting back up again, and Murdock and Daredevil going back to New York. Daredevil then helps out his dad's old coach, getting his current boxer out from under an extremist group. And then Daredevil and the Black Panther help out the Carver brothers, who are being bullied and harassed by the Thunderbolts. And then finally, the year ends with Daredevil going up against the Tribune, who attempts to be the judge, jury, and executioner of the New York Three after they've been arrested for blowing up the New York Hilton. And actually, that is going to be our spotlight story after a little bit. So if you're curious about that, it's actually a really interesting story, and it actually has some kind of shades as to what's going on currently, which is feeling a little weird too. But damn, that was the year in Daredevil, just kind of at a bullet point level, everything that sort of happened across the year. Some pretty decent stories, all in all, if not some very improbable things happening throughout the year as well.
There's a lot of improbable things that happen, but it's also, though, really been interesting watching Colin's art on this stuff and how it's evolved. There are sometimes, like in the very first issue of this year, he's got a couple panels where there's a speedboat going out with Daredevil on it, and
right,
the energy he puts into that, the way he can make it feel like that thing is just moving. Colin is really evolving as an artist in these. And as you move along, you start to see him a lot more effectively using solid darks and things like that. And you start to see also his inkers start to figure out how to deal with Colin's pencils. So him and Shores, by the end of this, are really doing a nice job of making these kind of moody, very big, dark sort of panels and everything. But I enjoyed these. Will note that they are packed with text.
Yeah.
Like Roy Thomas in his first, he's like, I got my job. I'm not going to let anybody down. I'm going to go like I'm paid by the word, right? It's just chock full of text.
Which actually then
a little less.
Which actually speaks to just how good a job Gene Colan is doing, because if you think about how big these panels aren't necessarily all that big, and then you've got all this words in it. It then means that the art that you are actually putting in there's not much room for it, right? So he does a really good job of maximizing like the imagery to go with all this text that's going with it. So like you really do, like now we have these very light text books where the images are telling the story. The images at this point, I think, are really good from the standpoint of he's not giving very much of the page to work with, but the part of the page that he gets to work with, he's doing a lot with. There's some very interesting looking things that are happening, like you're talking about with the speedboat. You know, when he gets like a full page, you get some really incredible looking things. And like I love like some of the explosions and stuff. A lot of the action sequences, I have to tell you, in some of the other books that we've read, some of the earlier books in like the 60s and 70s and stuff, a lot of times it felt really difficult to see what was going on because there was so much going on. Gene Colan has found a way, despite the fact there's all these words there, to put up an image that really conveys what the words are doing or complements the words, and it's still, you understand what's going on and it looks good. And then with the colors in addition, it's really incredible. And up until this point, I've had a really hard time like really appreciating some of the older comic books, but Gene Colan is really starting to make me appreciate some of these older comic books.
Well, and Roy Thomas might be too. Because
yes.
The other thing is that if you looked at the ones, especially near the end when it was Stan Lee and Colan, Lee had no control over Colan at all. So it would be like 4 full page spreads in the first 10 pages, and then he would just crash the story to an end when he had to because he'd run out of space.
Right.
And now Thomas is actually plotting this out and saying, hey, by page 3, I'm going to do this. So you see a lot of 5-panel, 4-panel, 6-panel things out of Colan, which I suspect he's a little bit like a caged lion here at this point, where he would really like to just make a massive action sequence that maybe doesn't make any sense. And then, you know, Stan Lee would come in and just put in some words about him thinking about, you know, what's happening with Foggy or with his girlfriend or something like this that would make it somehow work. But now it's story the whole way. So you're starting to get closer to, I can understand why you like these better. They've got a more modern conception of linear storytelling to them. Even if the story is batshit sometimes, it proceeds at an orderly pace through the book, you know?
Yeah. I mean, there still is some very kind of cut off sort of endings at times, but at the same time, for the most part, the stories are flowing at a more even pace where it's not just this and then just hits a wall because basically they ran out of pages for the book.
Here you go.
All right, let's talk about new powers, toys, and places. Obviously, a new place. We had Hollywood, California, where several of the issues take place. As far as powers and abilities, I want to point out Daredevil's now an actor. He is actually starring opposite Stuntmaster in the Stuntmaster TV show. We also find out he's an expert makeup artist because he, in the issue where he is going up or helping out his old dad's coach, Pop Fenton, he actually, to kind of lure out the extremist group, he actually makes himself look like the boxer who's supposed to be boxing, Kid Duane, so that he could be in a boxing match with a bad guy. Actually, like, just crazy. So apparently he's like an expert makeup artist on top of, you know, being the man without fear. So those were some things. He doesn't say that he's this sort of thing, but I mean, come on, if you're going to make yourself look like somebody completely different so you can pretend to be them with basically nothing on but boxer shorts, you got to be a pretty good makeup artist.
Skills. There you go.
Yes. As far as supporting characters, we got a whole slew of new kind of like secondary characters or characters that are people are interacting with this year. Sally Weston, which is Karen's friend in LA. We had Ross Archer, who, along with Bill Wheeler and Ed Lawson, were part of the storyline with Brother Brimstone on the Strange Secrets TV show. Ross Archer is the actor originally playing Brother Brimstone. He ends up dying by the person pretending to be Brother Brimstone that Daredevil ends up beating up and saving Karen from, and ends up getting into the La Brea tar pits. Bill Wheeler is the director of the TV show. Ed Lawson is the author / co-creator of Strange Secrets. Oh, I forgot to mention Lester Leroy. He is the creepy makeup artist on Strange Secrets, who seems to like Karen and who is framed by the eventual Brother Brimstone that ends up being into the La Brea tar pits. It's complicated. That's all I'll say. Pop Fenton is battling Murdock's trainer. That is his dad's old trainer that he ends up helping out. Kid Gawain is Fenton's new boxer that he's trying to train, and ends up needing Daredevil's help. We had Lonnie and Billy Carver. These are the brothers that Black Panther and Daredevil saved from the Thunderbolts. And then the New York Three, we mentioned them, and we're going to be talking about them in the Spotlight issue. These are 3 protesters who were arrested and accused of blowing up a hotel that the vice president was in during the end of the run in 1969. We also had an appearance by Walter Cronkite in those books as well, so I thought I would call that out as well. As far as new villains, we mentioned Crime Wave. Turns out to be the assistant to Foggy. We have the Trio of Doom. We have Nighthawk. We have Mr. Ellis.
It's a Nighthawk. So if you remember, when we were reading the Defenders books back in the Moon Knight days, Moon Knight was guesting with them to face off against the Zodiac. Nighthawk was actually on the Defenders team that he was working with. He was leading the Defenders kind of at that point, as much as anybody leads the Defenders.
Sure. I did not remember that.
So you've seen him before. He still had that weird goofy costume with the big red stripe things coming back. So yeah, he turns into a good guy eventually.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. Kind of strange. So for me, this is weird because I had not read this book before. I keep finding it strange when he's a villain. But even then, he was more like, I want to be the hero, and so I don't want to share being the hero, so I'm going to commit crimes to be the hero.
Yes.
It's not a great plan, but anyways, so I find him interesting.
All right, so after Nighthawk, we have Mr. Ellis. He is the crooked movie producer that turns out to be Brother Brimstone and is trying to frame Lester Leroy, and ends up on the business end of Daredevil and the La Brea tar pits. We had Crag, who is the leader of the Phoenix extremist group that Pop Fenton's boxer was trying to get out from under. We had the Thunderbolts. Specifically, we had Turk, Eddie, and Charlie, who were Thunderbolts. They call them Thunderbolts, but I don't think these are the same Thunderbolts.
These are not the Thunderbolts that people are used to. No.
Yes. I kind of gathered that it's just like this street gang that was pressuring kids into like committing crimes and things, I guess is basically what it was. And then last but not least, we end the year with Tribune, who is, well, yeah, he is one of these people that is a real American and is trying to get rid of these quote unquote pinkos and are ruining American society. So, but we'll talk about more of that in just a minute.
Excellent. Yeah, that sounds good. This has been a really interesting year, just in terms of, you've got so many people writing and so much going on, and Gene Colan seeming to take advantage of them to the extent that he can, or to just deal with it to the extent that he can't. I love watching how Colan interacts through these books. It's been a lot of fun.
All right, Dan, should we talk about the Spotlight books?
I would love to talk about the Spotlight books.
This week's Spotlight story.
All right, Duane, you wanted to talk about Daredevil number 70 from November 1970 and number 71 from December of that year. So we're finishing out strong, finishing out the year 1970 with this sort of double story. You like the double stories, it seems. Tell us about this. What did you like, and what happened here?
So this is the final 2-book arc of the year, and I have to say it is really interesting, and there is a lot to this recap. So we're going to probably stop and talk a bit of the way through this, but ripped from today's screaming headlines is how it's monikered, and tomorrow's frightening peril. Far-right motion picture star Buck Ralston has made an appearance on Hollywood Boulevard to speak to a crowd about his perceived lack of patriotism in America. And after engaging Karen Page in a debate about patriotism to the level of extremism, Buck Ralston leaves to plot how he will get back at the pinkos he perceives that are ruining American society. While in New York, Daredevil becomes involved in controlling a riot, which has broken out in New York at the New York Hilton between the police and protesters during the vice president's visit to the city. While back on the West Coast, we learn Ralston is taking the law into his own hands as this costumed judge, jury, and executioner known as the Tribune, and has his goons rounding up hippies that he finds treasonous and executes them with his energy blasting gavel. Yes, I said that right. An energy blasting gavel. It is a ridiculous thing as it sounds. So then Tribune has some men plant some explosives at the Hilton in New York in hopes that the hippies will be blamed, in hopes that it will wake up America. However, his plan is made complicated by the involvement of Daredevil. While Daredevil fails to stop the bomb from detonating, he prevents it from hurting anyone, even though one of the protesters checking on Daredevil then gets arrested. The young men that end up getting arrested on a bomb rap dubbed the New York Three get the attention of the Tribune, who plans to go to New York City to execute them, while Foggy and Matt prepare begrudgingly to represent the city in court and prove that they're guilty, even though both feel that the New York Three are innocent. And in fact, Murdock, as Daredevil, knows that they're innocent. Mm-hmm. So that was book 70, and kind of set up what's going on. And like I said, this Buck Ralston character just, to me, felt a little too familiar, I guess, given where we are in today's society.
Yep. Well, and back then, you had Ronald Reagan, who's essentially an old TV star, movie star, just taking over as governor in California. So it's something that was in the headlines then, just like it's in the headlines now. And I think you probably could. Friedrich probably was thinking about someone in particular, but who knows which one? Because there would have been, even back then, any number of potential choices that would have fit the bill. So, but yeah, this is sort of that whole relevance thing, and where you're starting to see Marvel now be written by younger writers, and they are more directly taking on sort of establishment positions and challenging them. Whereas Stan Lee is pretty establishment. He wanted to be hip and make the kids happy, but he was never really going to be a guy from the counterculture, right? And right. A lot of these guys are far more willing to to take on some of the powers that be, which I think is cool. I mean, I think it's what comics should do. So these books are much more interesting because of that. They also get a little preachy sometimes. I think 70 is rough in a few places. One thing, I don't know if you noticed, but it appears that Friedrich did not script this out probably as tightly as he could have. And you could see every once in a while, the panels keep expanding, and he's back to 3 panels on a page or whatever. And I find it interesting how he really does seem like you just need to keep him under control or he will go crazy. And he's even said that, that he loved that freedom that Lee gave him, but that he would go in at the end and Stan would be like, I gave you a story that was supposed to be 20 pages. You've done 5 pages of it, and you've used up 18 pages of our 20 pages of book, So, yeah. Anyway, these are really good. I also am surprised when you see Shores and Colin, there's sometimes it looks like Carmen Infantino to me. And I don't know why that is. Infantino back then was a really polished sort of, he'd done a lot of Flash stuff and everything. He was now one from the older generation. But I'd never thought before of Colin and Infantino having similar styles, but I see a lot of similarities in some of the drawing here. So that's kind of weird. Anyway.
Interesting.
You've got a whole nother issue for us.
Though, moving on to issue 71. While patrolling the streets at night, Daredevil tries to break up a fist fight, but it turns out that it's been faked in order to serve him with a summons to appear in court and testify in the case against the New York Three, which seems a bit problematic because he's part of the district attorney group that is trying the case already. As they prepare for trial, Buck Ralston travels to New York in order to personally execute the 3 in his costume identity of Tribune, believing them to all be guilty of anti-Americanisms. On the day of the big trial, Matt fakes a headache so he can have an excuse not to attend the trial, thus allowing him to attend as Daredevil. Meanwhile, Tribune incapacitates the judge that will be presiding over the case and then takes control of the courtroom. At first, Daredevil is helpless to do anything since the Tribune's men are surrounding the courtroom and doesn't want innocent people getting hurt. While on the witness stand, he hears an almost infinitesimal hum coming from the Tribune's belt. He leaps to action, smashes the belt, releasing the Tribune's men from their hypnotic control that they were under. The Tribune then leaves a bomb and tries to get away in a helicopter, but Daredevil throws the bomb at the escaping villain. It explodes, and the Tribune seemingly perishes. Days later, in the DA's office, Foggy is relieved that he actually lost a court case for once in his career, and that as the case of the New York Three is dismissed after the discovery the Tribune planned to frame them, catching a televised soapbox of Buck Ralston on TV, Matt, being wary of hearing people rabble-rousing, turns off the TV, little knowing that Ralston was the villain he fought and believed dead weeks earlier. So the Tribune presumably died in this crash with a bomb in a helicopter, yet somehow Buck Ralston is alive and still doing his American rabble-rousing rhetoric on TV, much to the chagrin of Matt, who's like, I'm done with all this.
Yep. Yeah, this was an interesting storyline overall. I think one of the things that that they made such obvious parallels to, the page 15, when you've got Daredevil coming into court and then the Tribune comes in as judge. The cop, one of the cops that's under his control, says, "All rise, 4th District Court is now in session, Right Honorable Tribune presiding." And he puts up his head his hand, and puts it out almost like a Nazi salute while he's doing this. And that's pretty certainly not, something that is accidental. So they're making sort of fascist symbols and stuff like this. There's a lot of things going on here where this is obviously poking the bears pretty heavily. This one was written by Roy Thomas as well, so actually it's weird. Friedrich kind of scripted and did some stuff and the like, and then Thomas came in and finished it up. So Thomas is now acting probably kind of like a mentor to a lot of these guys, just like Lee did for him a few years ago, where he's letting them sort of write scripts with him and stuff like that while they're getting their legs under them. Because Friedrich, of course, is one of those guys who was in the Rookie of the Year discussion.
Yeah.
But these are interesting books. Again, they get a little bit preachy sometimes, but then everybody starts punching each other and it's all fun and games, right? So I do think that we're starting to see some significant evolution at Marvel, and you are starting to see some of the disruptions that are going on in the culture starting to make their way into the comic books. For a long time, you had all of this stuff going on with the civil rights movement and everything in the country, and the comic books, like Marvel Comics, just sort of kept it all at arm's length and said, yeah, we suppose you all know how we feel about this, but we just want to entertain you, right? And the new guys are not having any of that. They're coming in and going, I'm writing stories. The stories are going to be about the things I'm seeing. Let's go ahead and make it happen. So I think these are good spotlight books.
Yeah. This felt just, it felt like something that, felt like today. And of course, this was, 50 years ago, 50 plus years ago. It's still just, it felt relevant. And so I wanted to spotlight these books and this. I would definitely recommend reading them. If you get a chance, they're on Marvel Unlimited. Would highly recommend reading this 2-book arc because it's quite good. It looks great. And like I said, the story is really interesting as well.
Yeah. And as a note, this is the only time we see Buck Ralston, as far as I know. So he's on the television, but nobody ever really picks him back up again. So if you're excited for the return of the Tribune, got some bad news for you. The one thing that I would note about this, as far as that too, is that considering he is a lawyer, having a supervillain who is a judge as his, like, one of his adversaries, actually, I think could have been cool. There probably is a story in here that would be interesting to see because, that they don't necessarily always play up the fact that Matt Murdock is a lawyer, Daredevil's a lawyer. This would be an interesting way of having him, go up against sort of an archetypical, opposite. Because that's a lot of times the opposites of a superhero are people who basically have the same powers as them,
Right.
And so if Murdock wields the law, then maybe his opponents should too. So I think there's a lot that could have been done there, but these were fun books in terms of getting that out there.
One last note: we talk about Nelson and Murdock and how great of lawyers they are, and I just loved how Foggy was so happy that he actually finally lost a court case in his career, but it just so happens that the one he loses is for the New York Three, who he was pretty convinced were innocent to begin with. So he wasn't such a good lawyer that he could get somebody guilty put in jail. That yep. He ended up losing the case, and so it's okay because they were innocent anyway.
I kid you not, I was rewatching My Cousin Vinny last night, and the country lawyer, the DA who's going against Vinny, was much the same. At the end of the trial, he's like, I guess you were right all along. If you ever want to come on back down, we'd be happy to take you out hunting or whatever. So that always a classic.
All right, Dan, that's going to wrap up the spotlight for this week. Let's move on and let's talk about the takeaway for 1970. This week's takeaway. All right, Dan, we've talked about comics in 1970, we've talked about Marvel in 1970, and we've talked about Daredevil in 1970. What's the takeaway for this year?
The takeaway for me for this year is that this was a tough season for Marvel Comics. This was a rough time to be a Marvel Comics fan, I would suspect, because you have Jack Kirby leaving, essentially, for fans, essentially unannounced. He just sort of's out the door. That's a massive disruption, extremely difficult on longtime fans. Almost nothing happened in the books this year that had lasting value to the Marvel Universe. So there was very little in terms of really interesting long-term content. Even if you look at Daredevil, these books, they were interesting. But what happened here that changed the Daredevil mythos forever?
No, absolutely nothing. I mean, it was just kind of, here's some entertainment this year. Let's move on. I mean, literally, you could pick up any of these books or a couple of books or whatever, and you could plot you could put them in anywhere, in any order, and by the time you're done, you're basically right back where you were.
Yep, the only actual difference is his girlfriend moving to California, right? That's really it. If it wasn't for the fact that we had one character actually move to a different part of the state, or if it wasn't for the fact that Karen moved to a different state and wasn't going to be there anymore, that really, I guess, does change things, and later on it makes a big difference. But really, these were very status quo kind of books, and I think this was a status quo year for the Marvel Universe. And there's maybe nothing wrong with that, but you wouldn't want to have too many 1970s if you're going to keep people interested. A large percentage of the new books, the new excitement that Marvel did bring out, were a bunch of reprints with comics from a decade or so earlier. DC trounced Marvel at the awards, and in fact had also been stealing away not only Jack Kirby, but potentially some other creators who were finding there were maybe some opportunities over at DC. I think fans legitimately had to wonder, how did an uptight company like DC, who everybody thinks of as the suits, right, end up to being actually the company that published mainstream comics' first interracial kiss in 1970? How are they the ones that have that Green Lantern story that essentially calls out superheroes? You have the famous panel where there's an old black man who comes up to Green Lantern and says, I've heard you've done great things for the purple people in some galaxy, or, you've helped all the orange people, but there's one color people you've never done anything for, and that's the black people. And Green Lantern's got nothing to say to him. And Green Lantern in those starts standing for sort of just traditional America. So DC just cleaned Marvel's clock in 1970. I mean, yeah, Marvel was trying to catch up to the world outside the window, kind of like those Spotlight books that we saw. There's increasing diversity, some more relevant storylines. But this is a company that literally just seems to be torn between the Civil and the Bronze Age, and it's unable to commit to either. And that probably is partly, at least, because they had so much success in the formula of the Silver Age. But that is dying, and they need to move on. Right now, though, they just kind of seem to be adrift. And there's not a lot of a direction or excitement in a lot of the books. Only real success we had in 1970 was that out-of-universe Conan the Barbarian comic. That went on to last 240 issues, ending in 1993, spawned all sorts of lasting legacy books. Sword and sorcery titles like Kull the Conqueror, Red Sonja. Conan books were actually great, but they aren't enough to save 1970 from being, in my opinion, the most underwhelming year since Fantastic Four #1 started the Marvel Age. So, it was not a great year for Marvel Comics. Let's hope 1971 turns things around.
Wow.
So I guess the takeaway is, don't print all reprints.
That's a good takeaway. That's going to put a wrap on this week's show. We'd like to thank you for joining us. If you're new to the podcast, please consider subscribing on your podcast player of choice. That way you'll get each new episode as soon as it's released. If you've already subscribed, we'd appreciate it if you'd share the show via social media or leave us a review. That will help new listeners find the show much easier. Whether you're new to the podcast or you've been with us from the beginning, we'd love to get your thoughts about this week's show. You can send those to us via email at comments@comicsovertime.com or via Twitter or Blue Sky. We're at Comics Over Time there. Until next week, take care, everybody.